Marcus Thompson pulled his beat-up 2018 Honda Civic into the driveway, the engine making that familiar rattling sound that reminded him he still couldn't afford the repairs. Through the warm glow of the dining room windows, he could see his family already gathered around the mahogany table his father had been so proud of, their laughter and animated conversations creating the perfect picture of holiday success. Little did they know that the man they'd spent 3 years calling the family failure was about to give them the shock of their lives. Marcus sat in his car for a moment, steeling himself for what he knew was coming. At 34, he looked tired. The kind of tired that comes from carrying invisible burdens rather than physical exhaustion.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you.
His clothes were clean, but clearly from discount retailers. His watch was a basic Timex, and his shoes had been resold twice. To anyone looking, including his own family, Marcus Thompson appeared to be exactly what they thought he was. A struggling veteran who couldn't get his life together after leaving the army. But appearances, as his family was about to learn, could be devastatingly deceiving. The Miller family Christmas dinner had been a tradition for over 40 years, hosted by Marcus's parents, Robert and Patricia Miller, in their sprawling colonial home in the affluent Highlands Ranch neighborhood. The house, with its perfectly manicured lawn and 3-car garage, represented everything the Miller family valued: success, stability, and social standing. Inside, the dining room gleamed with crystal glasses, sterling silver, and china that only came out for special occasions. Marcus's older brother David was already holding court at the head of the table, regaling everyone with stories from his job as a senior marketing manager at Pinnacle Industries, one of Denver's fastest-growing tech companies. At 37, David embodied everything their parents had hoped for in a son: 6-figure salary, beautiful wife Jennifer, 2 perfect children, and a BMW in the driveway. He wore success like a comfortable suit, from his expensive haircut to his Italian leather shoes. "So then I told the board," David was saying, gesturing with his wine glass, "if we don't capture the millennial market now, we'll be hemorrhaging money by next quarter. Sometimes you have to be the only adult in the room, you know?" Their sister Sarah, a successful real estate agent, nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the kind of strategic thinking that separates winners from losers in today's economy," she said, shooting a meaningful glance toward the empty chair where Marcus would soon sit. Marcus's parents beamed with pride at their eldest son. Robert Miller, a retired bank executive, had built his life on the principle that success was measured in dollars and status. Patricia, a former principal at an elite private school, valued achievement and social standing above almost everything else. They had raised their children to believe that worth was earned through conventional success. The bigger the salary, the more valuable the person, which made Marcus their greatest disappointment. 3 years ago, Marcus had returned from his final deployment in Afghanistan as a decorated army captain with multiple commendations for leadership under fire. But instead of leveraging his military experience into a traditional corporate career like everyone expected, he had seemingly vanished into a series of odd jobs and long disappearances. He worked construction 1 month, drove for a delivery service the next, and sometimes disappeared for weeks at a time for what he vaguely described as, quote, consulting work. His family saw only the surface. A man who couldn't hold down a steady job, couldn't afford a decent car, and showed up to family gatherings looking like he'd shopped at thrift stores. They worried, they lectured, and eventually, they had stopped expecting anything from him at all. Marcus said he'd be here by 6. Patricia sighed, checking her diamond-studded watch. Though with his schedule, who knows if that means anything. Maybe he's working another one of his mystery jobs, David said with a smirk. What was it last month? Food delivery? Or was he back to manual labor? Jennifer, David's wife, tried to change the subject, but Robert Miller was already shaking his head. I just don't understand how 2 brothers raised in the same house can turn out so differently. David, you've built something real, something lasting. Marcus. He trailed off, the disappointment heavy in his voice. The truth was that Marcus had built something too, something bigger than any of them could imagine. But he had learned in the military that sometimes the most important operations were the ones nobody knew about, And sometimes the greatest strength came from letting people underestimate you completely. As Marcus finally walked up the front steps, brushing snow off his modest winter coat, he could hear David's voice through the door. The problem with Marcus is that he never learned how to think strategically. Military guys are great at following orders, but they struggle with the big picture stuff that really matters in business. Marcus paused with his hand on the doorbell, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. In exactly 2 hours, David's boss, the CEO of Pinnacle Industries, would be joining them for dessert and coffee, a surprise David had arranged to impress their parents. What David didn't know was that his boss had been trying to schedule a meeting with Marcus for 6 months. Marcus rang the doorbell, straightened his shoulders, and prepared for what would either be the most uncomfortable Christmas dinner of his life or the most satisfying moment his family had ever experienced. As footsteps approached the door, he thought about the phone call he'd received that morning from his assistant. "Sir, the Pinnacle Industries acquisition is ready for your final approval. Should we proceed with the announcement after the holidays?" He had told her to wait. After tonight, he thought, the timing might be perfect. The door opened, and Patricia Miller's face brightened with genuine warmth despite her concerns. "Marcus, sweetheart, you made it. Come in, everyone's been waiting." As he stepped into the warmth of his childhood home, Marcus could already hear David launching into another story about his corporate achievements. The irony wasn't lost on him. In less than 2 hours, the man his family considered the successful son would discover he'd been bragging about his career to the very person who could end it with a single phone call. But for now, Marcus was content to be the family disappointment for just a little while longer. The moment Marcus stepped into the dining room, the energy shifted like air being sucked out of a balloon. David's confident storytelling faltered mid-sentence. Sarah's perfectly practiced smile tightened just slightly, and their parents exchanged that look, the one that said, "Here comes our problem child." What none of them realized was that they were about to start a conversation that would haunt them for years to come. "Marcus!" Patricia exclaimed, her voice carrying that forced enthusiasm parents use when they're trying to make the best of a disappointing situation. "We were just talking about David's big promotion possibilities at Pinnacle Industries. Isn't that wonderful?" Marcus hung his worn jacket on the back of an empty chair, the one positioned, he noticed, at the far end of the table, away from the places of honor. "That's great, David. Congratulations." David straightened in his chair, his confidence returning as he prepared to hold court once again. "Well, it's not official yet, but my boss has been hinting that I'm being considered for regional director. It would mean overseeing the entire Western market strategy." He paused for effect, letting the importance of his words sink in. Of course, not everyone is cut out for that level of responsibility. The comment hung in the air like smoke, and everyone knew exactly who it was directed toward. Robert Miller cleared his throat, his banker's instincts telling him to control the conversation before it went somewhere uncomfortable. "Marcus, how's work been? Are you still doing that delivery thing?" Marcus served himself a small portion of ham, keeping his voice neutral. "I've been staying busy, consulting work mostly." Sarah laughed, a sound that had no warmth in it. "Consulting? What kind of consulting can you do without a college degree or any real business experience?" She gestured around the elegant dining room. "I mean, look at David. He's built real relationships, real expertise in the tech industry. That's what consulting actually looks like." Jennifer, David's wife, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She had always liked Marcus, even if she didn't understand his life choices. "Maybe we could talk about something else? It's Christmas after all." But David was on a roll now, emboldened by his audience and perhaps by the expensive wine his father had opened. No, it's fine. Marcus knows we're just concerned about him." He turned to face his younger brother directly. "The thing is, at some point you have to stop making excuses and start building something real." "I mean, what do you actually have to show for the last 3 years?" Marcus continued eating, his expression unreadable. He had learned in Afghanistan that sometimes the best response to an ambush was to let the enemy reveal their full position before striking back. Patricia jumped in, her principal's instincts taking over. "Your brother has a point, sweetheart. We're not getting any younger, and we worry about your future. David has his 401k, his health insurance, his mortgage building equity. What happens to you if something goes wrong?"
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, Subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Mom's right, Sarah added, warming to the theme. I see it in real estate all the time. People who drift through their 30s without building anything substantial. Then suddenly they're 45 and have nothing to show for it except a bunch of random jobs and no real skills. Robert nodded gravely. In my banking days, I saw too many men who thought they could coast on their military service forever. The world doesn't owe you anything, son. You have to earn your place. Marcus set down his fork and looked around the table. His family's faces showed a mixture of concern, frustration, and poorly concealed disappointment. They thought they were helping. They thought they were motivating him. They had no idea they were about to learn the most expensive lesson of their lives. Is Hamati Tor Haid? You're right, Marcus said quietly. I haven't been completely honest with you about what I do. David leaned forward, smelling victory. Finally. What is it this time? Construction? Uber driving? Please don't tell me you're back to restaurant work. Actually, Marcus continued, his voice still calm. I run a company. The table fell silent for a moment before Sarah let out another laugh. A company? What kind of company? And please don't say some kind of pyramid scheme or cryptocurrency thing. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. It's called Thompson Strategic Solutions. We specialize in corporate acquisitions and market expansion. He scrolled through his contacts with deliberate slowness. We've been particularly active in the tech sector lately. David's expression shifted slightly. Something about Marcus's tone was different, more controlled, more authoritative. What kind of acquisitions? Well, Marcus said, still looking at his phone, we recently closed a deal with a Denver-based company, mid-sized tech firm, about 800 employees, focusing on software solutions for the healthcare industry. The color began to drain from David's face as recognition dawned. What was the name of the company? Marcus looked up from his phone, and for the first time that evening, his family saw something different in his eyes. It wasn't anger or hurt. It was the quiet confidence of someone who held all the cards and was finally ready to play them. Pinnacle Industries, Marcus said simply. You might have heard of it. The silence that followed was so complete that they could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. David's wine glass froze halfway to his lips, Sarah's fork clattered onto her plate, and their parents stared at Marcus as if he had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. That's impossible, David whispered, his voice barely audible. Pinnacle is worth over $200 million. It's publicly traded, He trailed off as the implications began to sink in. Marcus checked his watch, a gesture that everyone at the table suddenly realized looked more authoritative than they had ever noticed before. Actually, as of last Friday, Pinnacle Industries is worth considerably more than that. Market cap hit $430 million after we announced the expansion into the European market. He looked around the table at his family's stunned faces, then added almost casually, By the way, David, your boss called me this morning. He mentioned he was coming by for dessert tonight to meet the family. I told him that would be fine. The grandfather clock continued ticking in the hallway, marking the seconds until David's entire world would come crashing down around him. He should be here any minute now, Marcus said, returning to his dinner as if he hadn't just detonated a bomb in the middle of their perfect Christmas celebration. The doorbell rang at exactly 8:15, cutting through the suffocating silence like a blade. David's face had gone from red to pale to a sickly green color that matched the Christmas tree ornaments, while his parents sat frozen in their chairs like statues carved from pure shock. What happened next would become the most talked about Christmas dinner in Miller family history, and the moment their golden child learned that success sometimes wears disguises. I'll get it, Marcus said, rising from his chair with the casual confidence of a man who owned everything in sight, including the company that employed his brother. As he walked toward the front door, his family remained paralyzed at the dining table, their minds struggling to process what they had just heard. David's hands were shaking as he reached for his phone, frantically scrolling through news articles about Pinnacle Industries. His wife Jennifer watched in horror as her husband's face crumpled with each headline he found. Thompson Strategic Solutions acquires Pinnacle Industries in $430 million deal. Mystery CEO behind major tech acquisition revealed. Former Army captain builds business empire through strategic acquisitions. This can't be real, Sarah whispered, her real estate agent's mind calculating numbers that didn't make sense. Marcus can't own a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He drives a Honda Civic. That sounds like it's dying. Patricia clutched her husband's arm as voices approached from the foyer. Robert's banking background kicked in as he tried to make sense of what was happening. If Marcus really owned Pinnacle Industries, then his net worth the number was too large to comprehend. "David!" came a booming voice from the hallway. "Sorry I'm a few minutes late. Traffic was murder coming up from downtown." Marcus appeared in the doorway first, followed by a tall, distinguished man in an expensive charcoal suit, who looked exactly like what Central Casting would order for successful CEO. This was Richard Hawthorne, a man whose picture regularly appeared in Denver Business Journal and whose opinions on market trends were quoted in the Wall Street Journal. "Everyone," Marcus said with understated calm, "I'd like you to meet Richard Hawthorne. Richard, this is my family." Richard's face lit up with genuine pleasure as he surveyed the room, completely oblivious to the shell-shocked expressions staring back at him. What an honor to finally meet Marcus's family. I've been trying to get a dinner meeting with this man for months, and he keeps telling me he's too busy with family obligations. David managed to stand up, his legs unsteady beneath him. His boss, the man he had been desperately trying to impress for 2 years, was talking about Marcus like he was some kind of business deity. "Mr. Hawthorne," David croaked, his voice barely functioning. I work for you. David Miller, Senior Marketing Manager." Richard's expression shifted to polite recognition. "Oh yes, David. Marketing department, right? Good work on the Henderson account last quarter." He turned back to Marcus with obvious enthusiasm. "Though I have to say, your brother here is being far too modest about his achievements. Thompson Strategic Solutions has been the most aggressive and successful acquisition firm in the region for the past 3 years." The room spun around David as the pieces fell into place. Thompson Strategic Solutions. Marcus Thompson. His failure brother was the legendary mystery CEO that everyone in Denver business circles had been trying to identify. "I'm sorry," Patricia interrupted, her principal's training helping her find her voice. "There seems to be some confusion. Marcus he's been struggling since leaving the Army. He does odd jobs and—" "Odd jobs?" Richard laughed heartily. "Mrs. Miller, your son is one of the most successful entrepreneurs in Colorado. Thompson Strategic has facilitated over $2 billion in acquisitions over the past 3 years. We at Pinnacle were thrilled when he chose us for his latest expansion." Sarah's wine glass slipped from her numb fingers, shattering on the hardwood floor. $2 billion? Marcus had been watching his family's reactions with the detached interest of a scientist observing an experiment. Now he spoke, his voice carrying an authority none of them had ever heard before. "The consulting work I mentioned involves identifying undervalued companies with growth potential," he explained calmly. "The odd jobs were me working on factory floors and in delivery trucks to understand operations from the ground up. The mysterious disappearances were site visits and negotiations in other cities." Richard nodded approvingly. "Classic Marcus methodology. He believes you can't truly understand a company until you've worked alongside their employees. It's brilliant, really. No wonder his acquisition success rate is legendary." David sank back into his chair, his mind reeling, as years of condescending comments came flooding back. Every family gathering where he'd bragged about his corporate achievements. Every time he'd lectured Marcus about building something real. Every smug comment about military people not understanding the business world. "The beautiful irony," Marcus continued, looking directly at David, "is that your regional director promotion you mentioned earlier? That position opened up because we're restructuring Pinnacle's entire Western operations. The decision about who fills that role will ultimately come from Thompson Strategic Solutions." Richard checked his expensive watch. "Speaking of which, Marcus, we still need to discuss the Q1 integration timeline. I know it's Christmas, but when you're ready to talk business." "Actually," Marcus said, his eyes never leaving David's pale face. I think we can handle that conversation right now. David, as senior marketing manager, you probably have insights into the Henderson account Richard mentioned. Why don't you tell us about your strategic approach? David opened his mouth, but no words came out. How do you explain your marketing strategy to a man who literally owns the company you work for? How do you maintain any authority when you've just discovered that your failure brother could fire you with a phone call? The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 8:30, and Marcus smiled, an expression his family had never seen before. It wasn't cruel or vindictive. It was the smile of a man who had finally decided to stop hiding who he really was. You know what, Richard? Marcus said, straightening his modest sweater. Let's move this conversation to my office tomorrow. Tonight is for family. As Richard began discussing quarterly projections and market expansion strategies with the man his family had called a failure just 20 minutes earlier, Patricia Miller realized that everything she thought she knew about success, achievement, and her own children had just been turned completely upside down. The most successful person at the table had been hiding in plain sight all along. The 45 minutes that followed would go down as the most uncomfortable period in Miller family history, as Richard Hawthorne unknowingly delivered a masterclass in exactly how wrong a family could be about one of their own. What started as polite business conversation became an increasingly detailed breakdown of Marcus's empire, each revelation hitting David like a physical blow, while their parents sat in stunned silence, watching their entire worldview crumble in real time. The Denver Post has been trying to get an interview with you for months, Richard continued, completely oblivious to the family drama unfolding around him. They want to do a feature on Colorado's most successful young entrepreneurs, though I suppose young is relative when you're worth. He paused, catching himself. Well, I shouldn't discuss someone's net worth at a family dinner. Sarah found her voice first, though it came out as barely a whisper. What? What kind of numbers are we talking about? Richard glanced at Marcus, who nodded slightly. Based on Thompson Strategic's portfolio and assets, conservatively, Marcus is worth somewhere north of $800 million. Could easily break $1 billion within the next 18 months with the European expansion. The sound that came from David wasn't quite a gasp and wasn't quite a sob. It was the sound of a man watching his entire identity dissolve before his eyes. $800 million. His failure brother was worth more than some small country's GDP. Patricia's hands were shaking as she reached for her water glass. But Marcus, why didn't you tell us? Why let us think you were struggling? Marcus leaned back in his chair, and for the first time that evening, his expression softened slightly. Because I wanted to know who you really were, he said quietly. I wanted to understand what kind of people my family had become when they thought I had nothing to offer them. The words hung in the air like a judgment, and everyone at the table knew exactly what he meant. Every dismissive comment, every lecture about responsibility, every time they had made him feel small and unsuccessful, it all came flooding back with crystal clarity. Richard, sensing the tension but misreading it completely, tried to lighten the mood. You know, Marcus has mentioned that his family doesn't really understand what he does for work. I always assumed you were just being modest about your success. He laughed, not realizing he was driving the knife deeper with every word. Actually, Marcus said, his voice taking on that authoritative tone again, they've made their feelings about my career choices quite clear over the years. David's phone buzzed with notifications as news alerts about Marcus began flooding his social media feeds. His marketing background kicked in automatically as he read the headlines. Colorado's mystery billionaire revealed as former Army captain. Thompson Strategic Solutions, the acquisition firm everyone's talking about. From Afghanistan to Wall Street, a veteran's incredible success story. This is going viral, David whispered, showing Jennifer his phone screen. His wife's face went pale as she realized that their family's treatment of Marcus would soon be public knowledge, spreading across social media like wildfire. Robert, drawing on his banking experience, tried to regain some semblance of control. Son, this is incredible news. We're so proud of what you've accomplished. I think there's just been a misunderstanding about... No, Marcus interrupted, his voice firm but not angry. There's been no misunderstanding. You've been perfectly clear about what you think success looks like and what you think failure looks like. The only thing that's changed is your knowledge of my bank account. Richard's phone rang, and he excused himself to take the call in the living room. As his voice faded into the background discussing quarterly projections and board meetings, the Miller family was left to confront the wreckage of their Christmas dinner. "Marcus," Sarah began, her real estate agent's instincts searching for a way to salvage the situation, "we were just concerned about your future. We couldn't have known." "Known what?" Marcus asked. "That someone could be successful without needing your approval? That maybe your definition of achievement isn't the only one that matters?" Jennifer, who had remained largely quiet throughout the evening, finally spoke up. "Marcus, what you've accomplished is incredible, but you have to understand how this looks from our perspective. We thought we were being supportive by encouraging you to what?" Marcus's voice carried an edge now. "To get a real job like David? To buy things I couldn't afford to impress people I don't respect? To measure my worth by your standards instead of my own?" The truth of his words hit like physical blows. Every conversation they'd had about his future, every piece of unsolicited advice, every disappointed look, it had all been based on their own narrow definition of success. Richard returned from his call, his face bright with excitement. "Marcus, that was the board. They want to accelerate the timeline on the European expansion. The preliminary numbers from London are even better than we projected." He looked around the table at the stunned faces. "I hope I'm not interrupting family time with business talk." "Not at all," Marcus replied smoothly. "Actually, Richard, I should mention that David here has been telling me about his ideas for regional expansion. Haven't you, David?" David's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. How do you pitch ideas to someone who owns the company? How do you maintain any credibility when you've just spent 3 years calling that person a failure? Yes, I have some thoughts about the Western market strategy," David managed to stammer. "Excellent," Richard beamed. "Marcus always says the best insights come from people working in the trenches. Why don't you send me your analysis next week?" As Richard launched into another enthusiastic discussion about market penetration and consumer demographics, Patricia watched her younger son, the son she had worried about, lectured, and pitied, command the conversation with quiet authority. He wasn't showing off or being cruel. He was simply being himself, and that self was someone she had never bothered to know. The grandfather clock struck 9:30, and Marcus checked his watch. "Richard, I hate to cut this short, but it's been a long day." "Of course," Richard stood immediately. "Thank you so much for including me in your family celebration. And Mrs. Miller," he turned to Patricia, "you should be incredibly proud of Marcus. He's not just a successful businessman, he's one of the most ethical and principled people I've ever worked with." As Marcus walked Richard to the door, the Miller family sat in the dining room, surrounded by the remnants of their Christmas dinner and the shattered pieces of everything they thought they knew about success, family, and the man they had spent 3 years calling a failure. When Marcus returned, he stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at his family with an expression that was impossible to read. "The car outside," he said quietly, "isn't a Honda Civic because I can't afford better. It's a Honda Civic because I don't need to prove anything to anyone." He picked up his modest jacket from the chair, and for the first time in 3 years, his family saw him clearly, not as their disappointment, but as exactly who he had always been, a man who measured success by his own standards and didn't need their approval to know his worth. "Merry Christmas," Marcus said, and walked out into the night, leaving his family to contemplate the most expensive lesson of their lives. The silence that followed Marcus's departure was deafening, broken only by the grandfather clock counting down the seconds since their world had imploded. Within hours, what happened next would make the Miller family the most talked-about Christmas disaster in Denver's social circles. But first, they had to survive the aftermath of discovering that everything they believed about success, family, and their own judgment had been catastrophically wrong. David was the first to break, his hands shaking as he scrolled through endless notifications on his phone. The story was everywhere: business blogs, social media, local news feeds. Somehow, word had leaked about the Christmas dinner revelation, and the internet was having a field day with the story of the family who called their billionaire brother a failure. "Listen to this," David's voice cracked as he read from his phone. Colorado Business Weekly just posted, "Local family discovers their unsuccessful son is actually state's youngest billionaire." They have quotes from people at Pinnacle who've been talking about the mysterious CEO for months. Jennifer grabbed his phone, her face growing paler with each comment she read aloud. Imagine being so blind to your own family's success that you lecture a billionaire about getting a real job. This is what happens when parents only value conventional success. That brother is about to have the most awkward performance review in corporate history. Sarah's real estate instincts kicked in as she calculated the social fallout. This is going to follow us everywhere. My clients, my business partners. Everyone's going to know that we spent 3 years treating Marcus like a charity case when he could buy and sell all of us combined. Patricia sat motionless, her mind replaying every conversation she'd had with Marcus over the past 3 years. Every time she'd worried about his future, every lecture about stability and security, every moment she'd looked at him with pity, it all came flooding back with sickening clarity. $800 million, she whispered. Our son is worth $800 million, and we made him feel like a failure. Robert's banker training had taught him to analyze numbers, but these numbers didn't make sense in the context of everything he thought he knew. The construction work, the delivery jobs, it was all research. He was studying companies from the inside while we thought he couldn't hold down a steady job. David's phone buzzed with a text message, and his face went white. It's from my assistant at Pinnacle. She says HR wants to see me first thing Monday morning. His voice was barely a whisper. She included a link to an article titled, "When Your CEO is Your Brother, a Corporate Family Drama." The brutal irony wasn't lost on any of them. David had spent the entire dinner bragging about his corporate success to the man who literally owned his career. Every confident statement about business strategy, every condescending comment about military people not understanding the corporate world, it had all been delivered to someone who could end his employment with a single email. Maybe this will blow over, Sarah suggested weakly, but even she didn't believe it. In the age of social media, stories like this had a way of taking on a life of their own. Jennifer was still reading comments, her voice getting smaller with each one. The audacity of lecturing someone about building something real when they've built a billion-dollar empire. Imagine the family dinners from now on. Plot twist. The family disappointment was actually the family success story all along. The doorbell rang again, causing everyone to freeze. David peered through the window and saw a news van parked outside, with a reporter adjusting her microphone under the porch light. Channel 7 News, Patricia breathed. They're here about Marcus. The reporter's voice carried through the door as she spoke to her camera crew. We're here at the Miller family home, where sources tell us one of Colorado's most successful entrepreneurs revealed his identity to his family for the first time tonight. We're hoping to speak with family members about their reaction to learning that their son and brother is the mystery billionaire behind Thompson Strategic Solutions. David slumped in his chair as the full scope of their situation became clear. This wasn't just a private family embarrassment. This was a public humiliation that would follow them for years. Every business contact, every social gathering, every family function would be colored by the knowledge that they had spectacularly misjudged one of their own. We can't hide from this, Robert said finally, his banker's pragmatism taking over. The story is already out there. The question is how we handle it moving forward. Sarah laughed bitterly. Handle it? Dad, there's no handling this. We spent 3 years publicly pitying a man who could buy the entire neighborhood. We lectured him about responsibility while he was running a company worth more than most small cities. Patricia's phone started ringing. Friends and family members who had seen the news and wanted to know if it was true. Each call was a reminder of how thoroughly they had misunderstood their own son. Mrs. Henderson from next door just called, Patricia announced after declining another call. She wanted to know if it was true that Marcus owns Pinnacle Industries. Apparently, it's trending on social media with the hashtag #ChristmasFail. The weight of their situation was becoming unbearable. They had built their identities around being successful, accomplished people who understood how the world worked. Now they were the cautionary tale about parents who were so focused on conventional success that they completely missed their son building an empire. David's phone rang, and he saw Richard Hawthorne's name on the screen. His boss, his brother's employee, was calling him on Christmas night. With trembling hands, he answered. David? Richard here. Listen, I just wanted to call and say what an incredible evening that was. Your brother is even more impressive than I thought, and having dinner with your family really gave me insight into the values that shaped him." There was a pause. "I hope you realize how lucky you are to have someone like Marcus in your family." After Richard hung up, David sat in stunned silence. Even his boss was calling to remind him how wrong he'd been about his own brother. Outside, more news vans were arriving. The Miller family Christmas dinner had become a story about success, family, and the danger of judging people by appearances. But for the people inside the house, it was something much more personal. It was the night they learned that the person they had least respected was actually the most successful among them. As Patricia watched reporters setting up outside her home, she realized that Marcus's final words would haunt her forever. "The car outside isn't a Honda Civic because I can't afford better. It's a Honda Civic because I don't need to prove anything to anyone." Their son had been teaching them about true success all along. They had just been too blind to see it. The grandfather clock struck 10, and somewhere across town, Marcus Thompson, billionaire CEO and family disappointment, was probably having the most peaceful Christmas night he'd experienced in 3 years. Meanwhile, his family was learning that some lessons come with a price tag attached, and this one was going to cost them everything they thought they knew about success. 6 months later, the Miller family would discover that some bridges, once burned, leave scars that never fully heal. But sometimes those scars become the foundation for something better. What happened in the aftermath of that Christmas dinner became a masterclass in how success is measured, how families can rebuild from devastating mistakes, and how one man's quiet dignity could transform an entire family's understanding of what truly matters. The Monday morning after Christmas, David walked into Pinnacle Industries, knowing his career hung by a thread thinner than Christmas tinsel. The story had exploded over the weekend, making him the most famous middle manager in Denver for all the wrong reasons. As he sat in the HR office facing questions about his family dynamics affecting workplace relationships, David realized that his 3 years of condescending lectures to Marcus had just cost him everything he'd worked to build. "We're not firing you," HR Director Michelle Santos explained carefully, "but given the unique circumstances, we think it might be best if you transferred to our Phoenix office. Fresh start, new market, less complicated family connections." Translation: get as far away from your billionaire brother as possible before this embarrasses the company further. David accepted the transfer without argument. What choice did he have? Meanwhile, Sarah's real estate business imploded as clients canceled listings and potential buyers found new agents. "I can't work with someone who doesn't recognize success when it's sitting at her own dinner table," one client told her bluntly. "If you can't judge your own brother's worth, how can I trust you to judge property values?" Within 2 months, Sarah had lost 60% of her client base. The woman who had lectured Marcus about building something substantial watched her own career crumble because she'd been too blind to see his success. But the real transformation happened with their parents. Patricia Miller, the former principal who had valued conventional achievement above all else, found herself volunteering at a veterans support center. "I realized," she told the center's director, "that I spent so many years teaching children about character and integrity, but I failed to recognize those qualities in my own son when they didn't come wrapped in the package I expected." Robert took early retirement from his consulting work and began mentoring young entrepreneurs, particularly veterans, transitioning to civilian careers. "Success isn't always loud," he would tell them. "Sometimes the most successful people are the ones who don't need to prove anything to anyone." The media attention eventually died down, but the lessons lingered. The Christmas dinner story became a case study in business schools about perception versus reality, and a cautionary tale in family therapy circles about the danger of conditional love based on external achievements. Marcus, meanwhile, continued running his empire with the same quiet competence he'd always shown. Thompson Strategic Solutions completed 3 more major acquisitions, expanded into European markets, and was valued at over $1.2 billion by summer. But more importantly, Marcus seemed lighter somehow, as if revealing his success had lifted a weight he'd been carrying for years. The turning point came in June, when Patricia called Marcus for the first time since Christmas. Her voice was shaky, uncertain, nothing like the confident principal who had lectured him about his future. "Marcus, it's Mom. I was wondering, would you be willing to have lunch with me? Just us. I have some things I need to say." They met at a small cafe downtown, not far from Thompson Strategic's headquarters. Patricia looked older, humbled in a way that went beyond mere embarrassment. "I've been thinking about that night every day for 6 months," she began. "And I realized that we didn't just misjudge your career. We misjudged who you are as a person." Marcus listened as his mother talked about the past 6 months. How the public humiliation had forced her to confront her own values. How she'd realized that her definition of success had been dangerously narrow. How she'd spent decades teaching children about character, while failing to recognize it in her own son. "The worst part," Patricia continued, tears streaming down her face, "is that you tried to show us who you really were. The way you treated service workers with respect, how you never spoke badly about others, your kindness to strangers. We should have seen that the man with those qualities would never truly be a failure at anything he attempted." Marcus reached across the table and took his mother's hand. "Mom, I never needed you to know about my business success, but I did need you to love me regardless of it." "We did love you," Patricia protested. You loved the idea of who you wanted me to become," Marcus said gently. "You couldn't love who I actually was, because you never took the time to find out." That conversation became the first of many. Slowly, carefully, the Miller family began to rebuild their relationships on a foundation of actual understanding rather than assumptions. David, working in Phoenix, started calling Marcus regularly, not to ask for favors or business advice, but to simply talk as brothers. Sarah eventually rebuilt her real estate career, but with a different approach. She became known for seeing potential that others missed, for recognizing value beyond surface appearances. "My brother taught me that the most valuable things often come in unexpected packages," she would tell clients. The Christmas dinner story continued to circulate, but the family learned to live with it. Marcus even donated $1 million to a fund supporting veterans' career transitions, with the announcement statement reading, "Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the chance to prove their worth on their own terms." A year later, the Miller family gathered again for Christmas dinner. This time, Marcus arrived in the same Honda Civic, wearing another modest sweater, carrying a simple bottle of wine. But now his family saw him clearly, not as their disappointment or their success story, but simply as Marcus, a man who had built an empire while never losing sight of what truly mattered. As they sat around the same mahogany table where their world had changed forever, Patricia raised her glass. "To Marcus," she said, her voice strong and clear, "who taught us that real success isn't about what you have. It's about who you are when you think nobody's watching." Marcus smiled, the same quiet smile he'd always worn, and for the first time in years, his family saw it for what it truly was. The expression of a man who had never needed their approval to know his own worth, but who was generous enough to forgive them for taking so long to learn that lesson themselves. Some families measure success in dollars and status. The Millers had learned to measure it in character, integrity, and the wisdom to see people for who they truly are, rather than who they appear to be. It had only taken a billionaire hiding in plain sight to teach them the difference. 2 years after the Christmas dinner that changed everything, Marcus Thompson received a phone call that would prove his family's transformation was more profound than anyone could have imagined. What happened next showed that sometimes the greatest success isn't building an empire. It's building people who understand what truly matters, and watching them use those lessons to change other lives forever. The call came on a Tuesday morning as Marcus reviewed acquisition reports in his downtown Denver office. His assistant's voice carried an unusual excitement. "Mr. Thompson, you have a call from Emma Rodriguez at the Colorado Veterans Foundation. She says it's about your mother's application." Marcus frowned. His mother had mentioned getting involved in veteran affairs, but he hadn't realized she'd applied for anything formal. "Put her through." "Mr. Thompson?" "This is Emma Rodriguez, director of the Colorado Veterans Foundation. I'm calling about Patricia Miller's application to establish a new program through our organization. I have to say, her proposal is extraordinary, but we need to discuss the funding requirements. Marcus leaned back in his chair, intrigued. What kind of program is my mother proposing? She wants to create a comprehensive support system for veterans transitioning to entrepreneurship. Not just business training, but addressing the real barriers: lack of startup capital, difficulty translating military skills to civilian markets, and most importantly, overcoming society's preconceptions about what veteran success looks like. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. His mother, who had spent 3 years not recognizing his own veteran success, was now dedicating her retirement to helping other veterans achieve theirs. She's calling it the Thompson Initiative, Emma continued. After her son, she says, who taught her that success comes in many forms. Mr. Thompson, she's requesting initial funding of $5 million, with projections for $20 million over 5 years. It's ambitious, but her presentation was, well, it was incredible. Marcus smiled, remembering the principal who had once lectured him about practical career choices. Send me the proposal. I'd like to review it personally. That afternoon, Marcus read through his mother's detailed plan with growing amazement. Patricia had spent 2 years studying veteran entrepreneurship, interviewing hundreds of former service members, and developing a program that addressed every gap she had identified. The proposal was thorough, thoughtful, and would help thousands of veterans avoid the very misunderstanding she had shown her own son. But the real surprise came in the evening when David called from Phoenix. Marcus, I need to tell you something. David's voice was different, more mature, less certain than the confident corporate climber from 2 years ago. I've been working with a veteran-owned consulting firm here in Arizona. Small operation, run by a former Marine named Carlos Mendez. Guy reminds me a lot of you, actually. Marcus listened as David explained how he'd been quietly mentoring Carlos, helping him navigate corporate contracts and business development. The thing is, Carlos has an opportunity to expand nationally, but he needs backing. I was wondering, would Thompson Strategic consider partnering with him? What's in it for you? Marcus asked, curious about his brother's motivation. David was quiet for a moment. Nothing financially, I see what I missed with you. Carlos is brilliant, but people keep underestimating him because he doesn't fit their idea of what a successful businessman looks like. Sound familiar? Marcus arranged to meet Carlos the following week. The former Marine was everything David had described: brilliant, dedicated, and completely unaware of how impressive his operation was to outside observers. Within a month, Thompson Strategic had provided backing for Mendez Consulting's national expansion, creating jobs for dozens of veterans across the Southwest. But the biggest surprise came from Sarah. I have a confession, she told Marcus during one of their now regular coffee meetings. Remember Jennifer Walsh, that client who dropped me after the Christmas dinner story broke? Marcus nodded. Jennifer had been particularly harsh in her public criticism of Sarah's failure to recognize success. Well, it turns out her husband is a veteran struggling to start a property management company. Jennifer reached out to me last month, asking if I'd help him pro bono. Apparently, she'd been following Mom's work with the Veterans Foundation and realized she'd been just as blind as we were. Sarah had spent 3 months helping the veteran navigate commercial real estate, using her expertise to help him secure his first major contract. I'm not charging him anything until his company is profitable, and Marcus, it feels better than any commission I've ever earned. The transformation reached beyond the immediate family. Richard Hawthorne had started a program at Pinnacle Industries specifically designed to identify and promote underestimated talent, employees who might be overlooked because they didn't fit conventional expectations of leadership. Your Christmas dinner taught me something, Richard told Marcus during a board meeting. We had been measuring people by all the wrong metrics. Now we look for character, dedication, and results, rather than just presentation and pedigree. The ripple effect continued expanding. Patricia's Thompson Initiative became a model program, replicated in 12 states within 2 years. David's work with veteran entrepreneurs in Phoenix led to a regional network that helped launch over 100 veteran-owned businesses. Sarah developed a specialty in helping former service members transition into real estate careers. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when Marcus received a handwritten letter from a young Army veteran named Michael Stevens. Mr. Thompson, the letter read, I participated in your mother's program last year. Today, I signed my first major contract for my cybersecurity company. But more than that, your family's story taught me that success isn't about proving myself to people who don't understand my worth. It's about building something meaningful, regardless of who's watching. Thank you for showing me that sometimes the best way to succeed is to stop trying to look successful. Marcus kept that letter in his desk drawer, next to the crayon drawing from his niece that said, Uncle Marcus is the best, in purple marker. Success, he had learned, could be measured in many ways, but the sweetest measurement was knowing that your example had helped others find their own path. The Christmas dinner that had once threatened to tear his family apart had become the foundation for a legacy that touched thousands of lives. Marcus Thompson had built a billion-dollar empire, but his greatest achievement might have been teaching his family that real success isn't about what you accomplish. It's about what you inspire others to accomplish. 2 years later, when business magazines asked Marcus about his proudest achievement, he never mentioned his company's valuation or his acquisition success. Instead, he talked about his mother teaching entrepreneurs, his brother mentoring startups, and his sister helping veterans find their footing in new careers. The best leaders, Marcus would say, aren't the ones who succeed despite being underestimated. They're the ones who use that experience to ensure others never have to prove their worth the hard way. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't winning for yourself. It's changing the game so others don't have to fight the same battles you did. 5 years after the Christmas dinner that shook the business world, Marcus Thompson found himself standing in the most ironic situation of his career, delivering the keynote speech at Harvard Business School's annual Leadership Summit, where his own family story had become required reading in 3 different MBA courses. What happened that day would prove that sometimes the most powerful lessons come not from success stories, but from failure stories that teach us to see success differently. The auditorium was packed with 800 MBA students, executives, and faculty members who had come to hear from the man Forbes had dubbed the Invisible Billionaire, a CEO, who had built an empire while remaining virtually unknown until his family accidentally exposed him to the world. But as Marcus looked out at the eager faces, he knew they were expecting the wrong story. 5 years ago, Marcus began, his voice carrying easily through the packed auditorium. I sat at a Christmas dinner table and watched my family destroy themselves trying to help me become successful. Today, I want to tell you why they were absolutely right to be disappointed in me, and why that disappointment was the most valuable gift they ever gave me. A murmur rippled through the crowd. This wasn't the typical success story they were expecting. You see, everyone focuses on the moment when my brother's boss recognized me as a CEO. That's the dramatic part, the satisfying reversal that makes for good storytelling. But the real story, the one that actually matters for leaders, is what happened in the months and years before that dinner, when I made a choice that nearly cost me my family forever. Marcus clicked to his first slide, showing a simple photograph of a beat-up Honda Civic in a driveway. I drove this car for 3 years while building a billion-dollar company, not because I couldn't afford better, but because I wanted to prove a point. And that point nearly destroyed the people I loved most. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the audience. I convinced myself that I was teaching my family about authentic success, about not needing external validation. But the truth is, I was punishing them for their shallow values by withholding information that could have helped them understand who I really was. I called it principle. They called it secrecy. Looking back, we were both right. A student in the front row raised her hand. But Mr. Thompson, didn't your family's reaction prove that their love was conditional on your financial success? Marcus nodded. Absolutely. Their love was conditional. But here's what I've learned. So is mine. I love them conditionally too. I would only share my true self with them if they could love me without knowing about my success. I was testing them just as much as they were judging me. The auditorium fell silent as the implications of his words sank in. The moment that changed everything wasn't when Richard Hawthorne walked through our door. It was 6 months later when my mother called me to apologize. Not for misjudging my business success. That was just the symptom. She apologized for not taking the time to really know who I was as a person, regardless of my career. Marcus clicked to the next slide, showing a photo of Patricia Miller teaching at a veterans workshop. My mother spent 3 years lecturing me about building something meaningful. Today she runs a program that has helped launch over 500 veteran-owned businesses. She didn't become a different person. She became the person she always was, once she understood what real success looked like. A professor in the middle section spoke up. "Are you saying that your family's initial judgment was justified?" "I'm saying that successful leaders don't hide their light under a bushel and then get angry when people can't see it," Marcus replied. "My family made assumptions based on limited information. I provided limited information because I wanted to control their assumptions. We were both playing games instead of building relationships." Marcus shared the story of David's transformation in Phoenix, Sarah's work with veteran entrepreneurs, and the ripple effect that had spread across multiple states. But then he revealed something the business press had never reported. 2 years ago, I offered to bring David back to Denver as a VP at Thompson Strategic. He turned me down. Not because he was angry or proud, but because he'd found something more valuable than corporate advancement. He'd found his purpose helping other people build their dreams. The audience was captivated as Marcus explained how the Christmas dinner disaster had forced his entire family to examine their definitions of success, leading each of them to careers that focused on lifting others up rather than climbing higher themselves. "The business world loves comeback stories and underdog victories," Marcus continued. "But the real leadership lesson from my family's story isn't about proving people wrong. It's about helping people grow. The most successful thing I ever did wasn't building a billion-dollar company. It was learning to forgive my family for their shallow values and allowing them to forgive me for my pride." A young executive in the back raised her hand. "So what advice would you give to leaders who feel underestimated or misunderstood?" Marcus smiled. "Stop trying to prove your worth to people who don't see it, and start investing in people who do. But more importantly, examine whether you're creating the very misunderstanding you're complaining about. Sometimes the people closest to us can only love the version of ourselves we choose to show them." He clicked to his final slide, showing the Miller family at last year's Christmas dinner. The same table, the same people, but faces filled with genuine warmth and understanding. "My family spent 3 years thinking I was a failure because I didn't trust them with the truth. I spent 3 years thinking they were shallow because they couldn't see past appearances. We were both right, and we were both wrong. The real success wasn't when they finally understood what I'd built. It was when we all understood what we'd been destroying by not really knowing each other." As Marcus concluded his speech, the applause was different from typical business presentations. It was thoughtful, reflective, the kind of applause that comes when an audience realizes they've learned something that will change how they think about leadership, family, and success. During the Q&A that followed, a student asked the question that would become the most quoted part of his speech. "Mr. Thompson, if you could go back and handle that 3-year period differently, what would you change?" Marcus thought for a long moment. "I would have introduced my family to who I really was instead of waiting for them to discover it on their own. Real leadership isn't about being right. It's about being understood. And you can't be understood if you're hiding who you are, even for noble reasons." The Harvard Business Review would later call it the most honest leadership speech ever delivered. But for Marcus, it was simply the completion of a lesson that had started with a Christmas dinner disaster and ended with the understanding that the greatest success comes not from building empires, but from building relationships that can survive the weight of truth. Sometimes the most powerful leaders are the ones brave enough to admit that their greatest failures taught them more about success than their victories ever could. 7 years after the Christmas dinner that changed everything, Marcus Thompson received a phone call that would test whether all the growth, forgiveness, and family healing had been genuine, or just a beautiful facade hiding deeper wounds that never truly healed. What happened next would prove that some lessons require multiple tests, and sometimes the people we think we know best are still capable of shocking us in ways we never imagined. The call came on a Thursday afternoon, as Marcus reviewed quarterly reports from Thompson Strategic's now global operations. His assistant's voice carried an unusual tension. "Mr. Thompson, you have an urgent call from Jennifer Miller. She says it's about David." Marcus felt his stomach drop. David had been thriving in Phoenix, his mentorship program helping dozens of veteran entrepreneurs build successful businesses. What could possibly be urgent enough for Jennifer to call him directly? Marcus? Jennifer's voice was shaky, strained. I need to tell you something about David, and I need you to hear it from me before you hear it anywhere else. Marcus set down his pen, giving her his full attention. What's going on, Jen? David's been lying to all of us. For 3 years. The mentorship program, the veteran businesses, the whole transformation story? It's not what we thought it was. Jennifer's voice cracked. Marcus, David's been using his connection to you to manipulate people. He's been telling potential investors that Thompson Strategic is backing ventures when you're not. He's been trading on your name and reputation. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. After everything they'd been through, after all the growth and healing, David had been running a con game using Marcus's reputation as collateral. How long have you known? Marcus asked quietly. I found out yesterday. One of the veterans he's been mentoring called me directly. Marcus, this veteran, his name is Tony Ramirez. He mortgaged his house based on David's promise that Thompson Strategic would provide backing. When the deal fell through, Tony started asking questions. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the familiar weight of family disappointment, but from an entirely different angle this time. How many people are affected? At least 15 that we know of, maybe more. Jennifer was crying now. David convinced these veterans to take huge financial risks based on promises he couldn't keep. Tony lost his house, Marcus. A decorated Marine lost his family's home because he trusted your brother. The irony was devastating. David had spent years learning to recognize and support underestimated talent, only to become the person who exploited that very trust. He had transformed from someone who misjudged Marcus to someone who manipulated others using Marcus's name. Where is David now? Marcus asked. He disappeared 2 days ago when Tony started making calls. Left a note saying he was, quote, handling the situation, but his phone goes straight to voicemail. Marcus, there might be criminal charges. These veterans trusted him because they thought he represented you. Marcus spent the next 48 hours in damage control mode, but not the kind he'd expected. Instead of protecting his company's reputation, he found himself protecting the veterans David had deceived. Thompson Strategic's legal team worked around the clock to honor every promise David had made, regardless of Marcus's actual involvement. Tony Ramirez was the first veteran Marcus called personally. Mr. Ramirez, this is Marcus Thompson. I understand my brother made commitments that he wasn't authorized to make. Mr. Thompson, I don't want charity. Tony's voice was proud despite his circumstances. I just want to understand how I could have been so wrong about someone I trusted. You weren't wrong to trust, Marcus replied. You were wrong to trust the wrong person. But that doesn't reflect on your judgment. It reflects on his character. Over the following week, Marcus met personally with each affected veteran. He didn't just honor David's promises. He did something more. He offered each veteran a genuine partnership opportunity with Thompson Strategic, complete with proper due diligence, legal backing, and transparent terms. I'm not doing this because my brother screwed up, Marcus told each veteran. I'm doing this because after reviewing your business plans, I wish I'd met you 3 years ago. The truth was more complex than simple family loyalty or damage control. David's victims were genuinely talented entrepreneurs who deserved the support they'd been promised. David had actually identified real opportunities. He just lacked the authority or resources to deliver on his commitments. Patricia Miller arrived in Denver the moment she heard the news, her face showing the particular exhaustion that comes from watching a child repeatedly make the same mistakes in different forms. I don't understand, she told Marcus as they sat in his office overlooking downtown Denver. David seemed so changed, so genuinely committed to helping people. How did we miss this? Marcus had been asking himself the same question. Maybe we didn't miss it. Maybe change is more complicated than we wanted to believe. Are you saying David was lying about his transformation? No, Marcus said slowly. I think David genuinely wanted to help these veterans. I think he genuinely believed he could deliver on his promises. But somewhere along the way, his desire to be successful, to be like me, became more important than doing things the right way. The hardest call came 3 days later. David finally contacted Marcus, his voice hollow with shame and desperation. "Marcus, I never meant for this to happen. I wanted to build something meaningful, like you did. I wanted to prove that I'd learned from our family's mistakes." "By making completely different mistakes?" Marcus asked. "I thought I could make it work. I thought if I could just get these businesses off the ground, I could figure out the funding later. I thought maybe you'd see the results and want to get involved." "David, you used my name to manipulate vulnerable people into making decisions that destroyed their financial security. How is that different from what you criticized me for at Christmas dinner 7 years ago?" The silence on the other end was deafening. "The difference," David finally whispered, "is that you never hurt anyone except your own family. I hurt people who trusted me with everything they had." Marcus felt the weight of his brother's words. David was right. Marcus's deception had been self-contained, hurting only his family's feelings. David's deception had destroyed people's lives. "Where are you, David? Does it matter? My marriage is over, my career is destroyed, and I've ruined the lives of people who deserved better. It matters because running away is exactly what the David from 7 years ago would have done. The question is, are you that person, or have you actually learned something?" The phone call ended with David promising to return to Phoenix and face the consequences of his actions. Whether he would follow through remained to be seen. As Marcus hung up the phone, he realized that his family's Christmas dinner story wasn't over. It had entered a new chapter, one that would test whether transformation was permanent or just a temporary response to crisis. Sometimes the people we think we've helped save are still in the process of saving themselves. And sometimes the greatest test of a family's growth isn't how they handle success. It's how they handle failure the second time around. 3 weeks after David's confession, Marcus Thompson found himself sitting in a Phoenix courtroom, watching his brother take the witness stand in a fraud case that would determine whether the Miller family's story of redemption had been genuine transformation or just an elaborate intermission between disasters. What happened next would prove that sometimes the most important battles aren't fought in boardrooms or family dining rooms, but in the quiet moments when character is tested by consequences no one can escape. David looked smaller than Marcus remembered, his shoulders hunched under a simple gray suit that replaced the confident corporate attire he'd worn for years. As the prosecutor outlined the charges, wire fraud, misrepresentation, and breach of fiduciary duty, Marcus felt the familiar weight of family disappointment. But this time it was different. This time, he wasn't the one being judged. "Your Honor," David's voice was steady but quiet, "I want to change my plea to guilty on all charges." The courtroom erupted in whispers. David's lawyer looked stunned. They had been preparing a defense based on good intentions and misunderstood communications. But David had made a decision that surprised everyone, including his family. "Mr. Miller," Judge Patricia Hernandez said sternly, "are you certain about this decision? You understand that a guilty plea could result in significant prison time?" "Yes, Your Honor, I understand." David looked directly at the gallery where Tony Ramirez and 4 other affected veterans sat with their families. "I also understand that these people trusted me with their futures, and I betrayed that trust. No legal strategy can change that fact." Marcus watched as Tony Ramirez's wife squeezed her husband's hand. They had lost their home because of David's promises, but something in David's demeanor seemed to surprise them. This wasn't the man who had run away 3 weeks ago. This was someone who had decided to face the full weight of his actions. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following month, but David's guilty plea triggered something unexpected. Over the next 2 weeks, each of the affected veterans called Thompson Strategic's legal department with the same request. They wanted to provide character references for David's sentencing. "I don't understand," Marcus told Tony Ramirez during a phone call. "David's actions cost you your home. Why would you want to help him?" "Mr. Thompson, your brother made promises he couldn't keep, but the business plan he helped me develop was solid. The mentorship he provided was real. When Thompson Strategic honored his commitments, my company succeeded beyond anything I'd imagined." Tony paused. "David was wrong to lie about his authority, but he was right about my potential. That's worth something." Similar calls came from other veterans. David had identified genuine opportunities and provided valuable guidance. He just lacked the resources and authority to deliver on his promises. His crime wasn't recognizing bad businesses, but overcommitting to good ones. Patricia Miller arrived in Phoenix for the sentencing hearing, looking older but more determined than Marcus had seen her in years. "I've been thinking about this for weeks," she told Marcus as they sat in his hotel room the night before the hearing. "David made terrible choices, but he made them for better reasons than we made our choices 7 years ago." "What do you mean?" 7 years ago, we judged you because you didn't meet our shallow expectations of success. David committed fraud because he desperately wanted to help people succeed. Both were wrong, but one came from selfishness, and one came from misguided compassion." The next morning, the courtroom was packed not just with veterans and their families, but with members of the Phoenix business community who had watched David's work over the past 3 years. Marcus was surprised to see faces he recognized from Denver, people who had followed the Miller family story and were now witnessing its next chapter. Judge Hernandez reviewed the case with unusual thoroughness. "Mr. Miller, the court has received over 30 character references on your behalf, including letters from the very people you defrauded. This is highly unusual." She looked directly at David. "These letters tell a consistent story. You provided genuine value to these veterans, but you made unauthorized promises about financial backing. Your victims achieved success despite your deception, not because of it. However, they all acknowledge that your guidance was instrumental in their eventual success." David stood to address the court, his voice carrying authority Marcus hadn't heard since their Christmas dinner 7 years ago. "Your Honor, I spent 3 years trying to prove I wasn't the person who misjudged my brother's worth. In doing so, I became someone worse, someone who misrepresented my own worth to people who trusted me. I convinced myself that good intentions justified dishonest methods. I was wrong." He turned to face the veterans in the gallery. "To Mr. Ramirez, Mr. Jackson, Mississippi, Chen, and everyone else I deceived, I'm sorry. Not because I got caught, but because I knew what I was doing was wrong and I did it anyway. You deserved honesty, and I gave you false hope backed by lies." Judge Hernandez sentenced David to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 2 years of supervised release, during which he would be prohibited from engaging in any business activities without court approval. It was a lighter sentence than the prosecution had requested, but heavier than the defense had hoped for. As court adjourned, something unexpected happened. Tony Ramirez approached David before the bailiff let him away. "David, when you get out, if you want to do this right, with proper authorization and honest communication, call me. I know a lot of veterans who could use genuine mentorship." David's eyes filled with tears. "After everything I did to you? You made promises you couldn't keep, but you also saw potential that others missed. That's a valuable skill when it's used honestly." As Marcus watched his brother being led away in handcuffs, he realized that the Miller family story was more complex than he'd ever imagined. David hadn't failed to learn from their Christmas dinner experience. He'd learned the wrong lesson. Instead of understanding that success comes from authentic relationships built on truth, David had concluded that success required taking bigger risks and making grander promises. Patricia squeezed Marcus's arm as they left the courthouse. "He'll serve his time, and then he'll have another chance to choose who he wants to be. Do you think he'll make better choices next time?" Patricia looked back at the courthouse where her eldest son would spend the next 18 months. "I think David finally understands the difference between wanting to be successful and wanting to do right by people. Sometimes it takes losing everything to learn that lesson." As they walked toward their cars, Marcus reflected on how the story that had started with his family misjudging his success had evolved into David's story of misjudging the means to success. Both had involved deception, both had hurt people who mattered, and both had required facing uncomfortable truths about character and values. The difference was that this time, the entire family understood that redemption wasn't a destination. It was a daily choice that required constant vigilance and absolute honesty, especially with the people who trusted you most. Some lessons, Marcus realized, require multiple attempts and different kinds of failure before they truly sink in. The question wasn't whether David would get another chance. It was whether he would be wise enough to take it. 14 months into David's 18-month sentence, Marcus Thompson received a letter that would fundamentally change how he understood redemption, family loyalty, and the difference between punishment and transformation. What his brother had written from federal prison would prove that sometimes the most profound growth happens not when the world is watching, but when you're stripped of everything except the choice to become better or become bitter. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning at Thompson Strategic's headquarters, written in David's careful handwriting on standard prison stationery. Marcus had been expecting routine updates about David's progress, but what he found was something entirely different. A document that read like a masterclass in accountability, humility, and the hard work of genuine change. Marcus, the letter began, I'm writing this at 5 a.m. in a federal facility in Arizona, surrounded by men who made different kinds of mistakes than mine, but who are all facing the same question. Who do you become when everything is taken away except your character? I think I finally have an answer. Marcus set down his coffee and continued reading, drawn in by a voice that sounded like his brother but carried a weight and clarity he'd never heard before. You remember how I used to complain that our family never recognized your success until it was impossible to ignore? I thought I understood the lesson, that people judge by appearances instead of substance. But I completely missed the real point. The problem wasn't that our family was blind to your worth. The problem was that I was so focused on being recognized for my worth that I forgot to actually develop any. The letter went on to describe David's daily routine at the Federal Correctional Institution, not the harsh prison life Marcus had imagined, but a structured environment where David had volunteered for every educational and service program available. He was teaching financial literacy to other inmates, working in the prison library, and participating in a victim impact program that required him to write detailed apologies to every person his fraud had affected. The victim impact counselor made me understand something that the judge, the lawyers, and even my own family couldn't get through to me, David wrote. When I used your name to make promises I couldn't keep, I wasn't just stealing your reputation. I was stealing these veterans' right to make informed decisions about their own lives. Tony Ramirez didn't just lose his house because of my lies. He lost his ability to trust his own judgment. Marcus found himself reading more slowly, absorbing the depth of insight his brother was demonstrating. This wasn't the David who had run away when things got difficult, or the David who had spent years making excuses for his failures. This was someone who had finally stopped deflecting and started examining. I've been reading everything I can about business ethics, not because I think I'll run another company someday, but because I wanted to understand how many ways I went wrong. Did you know that the most successful entrepreneurs have failure rates of over 60%? The difference isn't that they make fewer mistakes, it's that they make honest mistakes and learn from them instead of dishonest mistakes that hurt other people. The letter included something Marcus hadn't expected: detailed business plans for 3 different veteran-owned companies that David had been developing with fellow inmates who were also veterans. But these weren't the grandiose schemes of the past. They were modest, carefully researched proposals with realistic timelines and honest assessments of both opportunities and risks. My cellmate is a former Navy SEAL named Rodriguez, who embezzled money from a nonprofit he was running for homeless veterans. He tells me that the hardest part of being in here isn't the loss of freedom. It's learning to live with the fact that good intentions can cause real harm when they're not backed by integrity and competence. Marcus was struck by the maturity in David's analysis. His brother was finally distinguishing between wanting to do good and actually doing good, a distinction that had eluded him for years. I know that when I get out in 4 months, I'll be a convicted felon with limited options and supervised release conditions that restrict my business activities. I also know that Tony Ramirez and 6 other veterans have written to me saying they'd welcome my involvement in their companies if I can prove I've learned to operate with complete transparency and proper authorization. The letter concluded with something that brought tears to Marcus's eyes, not because it was sentimental, but because it demonstrated genuine wisdom. Marcus, I spent 3 years after our Christmas dinner trying to prove I wasn't the person who misjudged you. I should have spent that time learning to become someone worthy of your respect, instead of someone desperate for your validation. The difference is everything. I don't know what kind of life I'll build when I get out, but I know it will be built on honesty about my capabilities, transparency about my limitations, and respect for other people's right to make informed decisions. That's not much, but it's real. Your brother David, who finally understands the difference between wanting to be successful and actually being useful. Marcus set the letter down, and stared out his office window at downtown Denver. In 18 pages of careful handwriting, David had demonstrated more genuine insight than in all their previous conversations combined. This wasn't the man who had used Marcus's name to defraud veterans. This was someone who had spent 14 months learning to see himself clearly. But what struck Marcus most was what David hadn't asked for. No requests for money, no appeals for business opportunities, no attempts to leverage family connections. Just honest accounting of his failures and realistic plans for authentic contribution. Marcus's assistant knocked on his door. "Mr. Thompson, you asked me to remind you about the board meeting at 10. Marcus looked at his watch, 9:45 a.m. He had been so absorbed in David's letter that he'd lost track of time completely. "Cancel it," he said. "I need to make a phone call." He dialed the number for the Federal Correctional Institution in Phoenix and asked to schedule a visit with inmate David Miller. For the first time in 8 years, Marcus wanted to have a conversation with his brother, not because family obligation required it, but because he was genuinely curious about what David had learned and who he was becoming. Sometimes the most important growth happens not when people are trying to impress you, but when they've stopped trying to impress anyone and started trying to understand themselves. As Marcus began drafting his reply to David's letter, he realized that his brother's transformation might be the most authentic thing any member of the Miller family had accomplished since that Christmas dinner 8 years ago. The question was whether this growth would survive the test of freedom, or whether it was just another temporary response to consequences that would fade when the pressure was removed. The day David Miller walked out of federal prison, he faced a test that would determine whether 18 months of apparent transformation had created genuine change, or just another carefully constructed performance designed to win back his family's trust. What happened in the first 72 hours of his freedom would prove that sometimes the most important moment in a redemption story isn't the dramatic revelation of change, but the quiet choices made when no one is forcing you to be better. Marcus waited in the parking lot of the Federal Correctional Institution in Phoenix, watching the gate where his brother would emerge. He had driven from Denver himself rather than sending a car service, partly because he wanted privacy for their conversation, but mostly because he wasn't sure what version of David would walk through that gate. At 8:17 a.m., David appeared wearing the same simple gray suit he'd worn to court 18 months earlier, now altered to fit his leaner frame. He carried a single duffel bag and walked with a different posture. Not the defeated slump of someone broken by incarceration, but the measured gait of someone who had learned to move through the world with deliberate purpose. "Marcus," David said, extending his hand rather than attempting a hug, "thank you for coming." The handshake was firm but brief. David's eyes met Marcus's directly, without the desperate need for approval that had characterized their interactions for years. This was the first test. Would David immediately begin performing his rehabilitation, or would he simply be himself? "How are you feeling?" Marcus asked as they drove toward downtown Phoenix. "Nervous," David replied honestly. "Not about being free, but about whether I can build something worthwhile with supervised release restrictions and a felony conviction. It's one thing to develop business plans in prison where failure is theoretical. It's another thing to execute them when people's livelihoods depend on your competence." Marcus was struck by the directness of David's answer. No false confidence, no attempts to minimize the challenges ahead. Just honest assessment of his situation. Their first stop was a meeting Marcus had arranged with Tony Ramirez at his security consulting firm, which had grown to 12 employees since Thompson Strategic had honored David's original commitments. Tony had specifically requested to meet with David upon his release, but he hadn't explained why. "David," Tony said, standing as they entered his conference room, "you look different." 18 months will do that," David replied with a slight smile. "Thank you for agreeing to see me. I know you didn't have to." Tony gestured for them to sit. "I wanted to make you an offer, but first I need to know something. Are you here because you think you deserve a second chance, or because you want to earn one?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus watched his brother's face, curious how David would respond to such direct confrontation. "I'm here because you asked me to be," David said simply. "I don't deserve anything except the consequences of my choices. But if you think I can be useful to your company within the constraints of my supervised release, I'm interested in earning that opportunity one day at a time." Tony nodded slowly. My company has grown faster than I expected. I need someone to help develop business processes and mentor other veteran entrepreneurs. The position would be part-time, heavily supervised, and would require complete financial transparency. You'd be working under my direct oversight, with no independent authority over company funds or client relationships. Marcus realized this was the moment that would define David's post-prison trajectory. Would he accept a subordinate role that acknowledged his limitations, or would pride interfere with practical opportunity? "What's the salary?" David asked. $40,000 a year, part-time, about a quarter of what you were making before. David was quiet for a long moment. Marcus knew his brother was calculating. $40,000 wouldn't cover the restitution payments still owed to victims, wouldn't allow for the lifestyle David had previously maintained, wouldn't provide the status he'd once craved. "When do I start?" David asked. Tony smiled. "Monday. But David, understand this. I'm not hiring you because I feel sorry for you, or because of your connection to Marcus. I'm hiring you because the business plans you developed in prison show genuine insight into veteran entrepreneurship. You identified real problems and proposed practical solutions. That's valuable, as long as it's backed by honest execution." As they left Tony's office, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced with his brother in years: genuine pride. Not pride in David's achievements or success, but pride in his character under pressure. Their next stop was the supervised release office, where David would check in weekly for the next 2 years. The meeting was routine: employment verification, residence confirmation, travel restrictions. But Marcus noticed how David interacted with his probation officer. No attempts to charm or manipulate, just straightforward compliance with requirements. "The hardest part," David told Marcus as they drove to his new apartment, "isn't the restrictions or the reduced income. It's learning to be useful rather than impressive. In prison, I had time to figure out that I'd spent my entire adult life trying to be someone worth envying instead of someone worth trusting." David's apartment was a studio in a modest complex, furnished with basics purchased secondhand. As they carried his single bag inside, Marcus was reminded of his own choice to drive a beat-up Honda while building his empire. But there was a crucial difference. Marcus had hidden his success to prove a point. David was accepting his circumstances to build character. "David, can I ask you something?" Marcus said as they stood in the simple apartment. "Do you regret what happened?" David thought carefully before answering. "I regret the harm I caused to people who trusted me. I regret the years I wasted trying to prove my worth instead of developing it. But I don't regret the consequences. Prison gave me something I'd never had: clarity about who I actually am versus who I was pretending to be." As Marcus drove back to Denver that evening, he reflected on the day's events. David had passed every test: accepting a subordinate role, complying with restrictions without complaint, choosing honesty over impression management. But the real test wasn't a single day of good choices. The real test would be whether David could maintain this authenticity when the novelty of freedom wore off, when the constraints of supervised release became frustrating, when opportunities arose that might tempt him to cut corners again. 18 months in prison had given David time to think about who he wanted to become. The next 2 years of supervised release would reveal whether he had the strength to actually become that person. Sometimes redemption isn't about dramatic transformations or tearful reunions. Sometimes it's about showing up every day, doing honest work, and proving through consistency, rather than promises that change is real and lasting. 22 months after David's release from prison, the Miller family prepared for a Christmas dinner that would answer the question everyone had been avoiding. Had David's transformation survived the test of time? Or would this gathering reveal that redemption was just another performance that couldn't withstand the pressure of old family dynamics? What happened that night would prove that sometimes the greatest victory isn't avoiding your past mistakes, but choosing how to handle them when they inevitably resurface. Marcus arrived at his parents' house to find an unfamiliar scene. David's car was already in the driveway, but it wasn't the modest sedan Marcus expected. Instead, a brand new Toyota Camry sat next to Patricia's Mercedes, sparkling under the Christmas lights. Marcus felt his stomach tighten. Had David already started making the same mistakes that had led to his downfall? Inside, Marcus found David in the kitchen helping Patricia with dinner preparations, wearing a simple sweater and jeans. But something was different. David moved with quiet confidence, engaging in conversation without the desperate need to impress that had characterized his pre-prison behavior. "Marcus," David smiled, genuinely pleased to see his brother. "Mom was just telling me about the expansion of the Thompson initiative. 500 veteran businesses launched this year?" 512, Patricia corrected proudly. "Though I think David's mentorship program in Phoenix might be giving us competition." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Mentorship program?" David dried his hands on a dish towel. "Tony's company has been so successful that we started a formal program to help other veteran entrepreneurs. Nothing fancy, just practical guidance on business development and avoiding the kinds of mistakes I made." "And the new car?" Marcus asked directly. He had learned that direct questions often revealed more than polite conversation. David laughed. "Ah, you noticed. It's a company car. Tony's firm won a major government contract last month, and he insisted I needed reliable transportation to visit client sites. It's technically his, but I get to drive it." The explanation was plausible, but Marcus remained cautious. The David of old had been an expert at making questionable decisions sound reasonable. Sarah arrived with her family shortly after, and Marcus watched the interaction carefully. Would David fall back into old patterns of trying to prove his worth through impressive stories and exaggerated achievements? "Uncle David!" Sarah's teenage son Jake ran to hug David enthusiastically. "Mom says you're helping veterans start businesses. That's so cool." "Your mom's being generous," David replied. "I mostly help with paperwork and connecting people with resources. The veterans do all the real work." Marcus was struck by David's response. The old David would have inflated his role, claimed credit for others' successes, and turned a simple question into a self-promotional speech. This David deflected credit and acknowledged his limitations. Benjoso Kita. As the family gathered for dinner, Robert Miller raised his wine glass for the traditional Christmas toast. "To family," he began, "and to the understanding that we're all still learning how to be better versions of ourselves." The toast felt pointed, and Marcus wondered if his father was making a subtle reference to David's journey. But as conversation flowed around the table, Marcus noticed something remarkable. Nobody was walking on eggshells around David, and David wasn't performing for anyone's approval. The real test came when Jennifer, David's ex-wife, arrived with their 2 children for dessert. This was the first time she had agreed to be in the same room with David since his conviction, and the tension was immediately palpable. "David," Jennifer said stiffly, accepting a polite hug from her ex-husband. "You look well." "Thank you for bringing the kids," David replied. "I know this isn't easy for you." Their 8-year-old daughter Emma immediately climbed onto David's lap. "Daddy, when are you going to come visit us again?" Marcus watched David's face carefully. This was the moment when the old David might have made promises he couldn't keep, or tried to guilt Jennifer into allowing more visitation. "That depends on your mom, sweetheart," David said gently. "But I hope we can work something out that makes everyone comfortable." Jennifer's expression softened slightly. This wasn't the manipulative ex-husband she remembered, the one who had used their children as leverage in emotional arguments. The evening's most significant moment came when David excused himself to take a phone call. Through the kitchen window, Marcus could see him pacing in the backyard, speaking earnestly to whoever was on the other end. When David returned, his face was serious. "Everything okay?" Patricia asked. "One of the veterans in our mentorship program is having a crisis," David explained. "His startup is failing, and he's talking about making some desperate decisions. I need to drive back to Phoenix tonight to meet with him tomorrow morning." "On Christmas?" Sarah asked. "Sometimes people need help when it's inconvenient," David said simply. "Tony's covering for me, but this veteran doesn't trust anyone else yet." Marcus studied his brother's face. "What kind of desperate decisions?" David hesitated. "The kind I might have made 8 years ago. Cutting corners, overpromising to investors, using other people's money to buy time. He looked directly at Marcus, the kind that seem reasonable when you're panicking, but destroy trust forever. This was it, the moment Marcus had been waiting for. Would David use this crisis as an excuse to leave early and avoid family scrutiny? Would he exaggerate his importance in solving the problem? Would he reveal any hidden motives or agendas? "How can we help?" Marcus asked. David looked surprised. "You don't need to do anything. This is my responsibility." "David," Patricia said firmly, "you don't have to handle every crisis alone anymore. What does this veteran need?" David was quiet for a moment, clearly uncomfortable with asking for help. Honestly, he needs to hear from someone who built a successful business without compromising their integrity. He needs to understand that there are ethical ways to handle business challenges. Marcus stood up. "I'll drive to Phoenix with you. It's time I met some of these veterans you've been working with." "Marcus, you don't understand. This isn't about networking or business development. This veteran might lose everything, and there's no guarantee we can help him." "I understand perfectly," Marcus replied. "Sometimes the most important business we do is the kind that doesn't benefit us directly." As David packed his overnight bag, Marcus realized that his brother had passed the ultimate test. When faced with a choice between family comfort and helping someone in crisis, David had chosen service over self-interest. When offered help, he had tried to protect others from inconvenience rather than leveraging their resources for his own benefit. The drive to Phoenix would give Marcus a chance to see David's work firsthand, but more importantly, it would show whether David's transformation extended beyond personal behavior to genuine leadership and service to others. Sometimes the best measure of character isn't how someone handles success or failure, but how they respond when someone else needs help and there's nothing in it for them, except the opportunity to do the right thing. The 6-hour drive from Denver to Phoenix became the conversation Marcus and David had needed for 10 years. Not about business or family expectations or past mistakes, but about what it actually meant to use success in service of something larger than yourself. What they discovered that night would prove that sometimes the most important partnerships aren't built in boardrooms or family dinner tables, but on long drives when two people finally understand what they're both trying to accomplish. "Tell me about Carlos," Marcus said as they crossed into New Mexico, the highway stretching ahead under a canopy of stars. Carlos Mendez was the veteran whose crisis had pulled David away from Christmas dinner, a former Army medic who had built a medical device startup that was now teetering on the edge of collapse. Carlos developed a portable diagnostic device for rural medical clinics, David explained, his voice carrying genuine concern rather than business excitement. "The technology is revolutionary. It could save thousands of lives in underserved communities. But he's run out of funding, and investors are pressuring him to cut corners on FDA approval to get to market faster." Marcus understood immediately. And he's considering it because the alternative is losing everything he's built. Exactly. It's the same choice I faced 8 years ago. Compromise your principles to save your business, or watch everything collapse while doing the right thing. David stared out at the desert landscape. The difference is that Carlos's decision affects people's lives, not just investors' portfolios. As they drove through the night, David painted a picture of the veteran entrepreneur network he'd helped build in Phoenix. Unlike his previous ventures that had focused on impressive growth and market dominance, this program emphasized sustainable development, ethical practices, and genuine service to communities. "The hardest part," David continued, "isn't teaching business skills. Most veterans already understand leadership, teamwork, and execution better than MBA graduates. The challenge is helping them navigate civilian business culture without losing the values that made them good soldiers." Marcus found himself genuinely impressed by David's insights. This wasn't the superficial business knowledge his brother had once flaunted, but deep understanding gained through genuine service and careful observation. "How many businesses have you helped launch?" Marcus asked. "Directly? About 30 over the past 2 years. But honestly, my role is mostly connecting people with resources and helping them avoid the mistakes I made. Tony does the real mentoring. I'm more like a cautionary tale with useful contacts." They reached Phoenix at 2 a.m. and drove directly to Carlos's workshop, a converted warehouse where the veteran had built his medical device prototypes. Carlos met them at the door, looking exhausted and desperate. The same expression Marcus remembered seeing in mirrors during his own darkest business moments. "David, thank you for coming," Carlos said, his voice strained. "And Mr. Thompson, I appreciate you making the drive, but I'm not sure how a billionaire CEO can help with my specific problem." Marcus smiled. "Call me Marcus. And you'd be surprised how many impossible situations can be solved when people are willing to work together honestly." Over the next 3 hours, Marcus listened as Carlos explained his situation with brutal honesty. The medical device worked perfectly, but FDA approval would take 18 months and cost another $2 million. Investors were threatening to withdraw funding unless Carlos agreed to launch internationally first, in countries with less stringent safety requirements. "They're telling me I can save lives immediately instead of waiting for FDA bureaucracy," Carlos said. "And they're not wrong. People are dying while I follow protocols that might be unnecessarily cautious." David leaned forward. "Carlos, what do you think happens to your credibility if your device causes harm in international markets? Even if it's statistically safer than existing alternatives." "I lose everything," Carlos admitted. "But if I don't take this deal, I lose everything anyway." Marcus had been quiet during most of the conversation, but now he spoke up. "Carlos, what if there was a third option? What if you could maintain full FDA compliance while also getting your device to market in a way that serves your mission?" "I'm listening." Thompson Strategic has relationships with medical device manufacturers who specialize in FDA-compliant development. We also work with foundations that fund humanitarian medical technology. What if we helped you restructure this as a social enterprise instead of a traditional startup? Over the next hour, Marcus outlined a partnership model that would allow Carlos to maintain complete ethical control while accessing the resources needed for proper development. Thompson Strategic would provide bridge funding, connect Carlos with appropriate partners, and help establish a foundation structure that could distribute devices to underserved communities, regardless of profit margins. "But why would you do this?" Carlos asked. "What's in it for Thompson Strategic?" Marcus looked at David, then back at Carlos. "Because my brother spent 2 years learning that the most sustainable business model is helping other people succeed ethically. Thompson Strategic has more money than we can spend in a lifetime. The question is whether we can use it to create value that outlasts quarterly profit reports." David was staring at Marcus with an expression of amazement. "You're serious about this?" "I'm serious about working with people who understand that business success should serve human needs, not the other way around." Marcus turned to Carlos. "The question is whether you're willing to build something that prioritizes impact over exit strategy." Carlos was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of Marcus's offer. This would mean giving up the possibility of making millions if the device becomes commercially successful. It would mean ensuring the device actually serves the people who need it most. David said quietly. "Sometimes the most successful outcome isn't the most profitable one." As dawn broke over Phoenix, the 3 men shook hands on an agreement that would transform Carlos's startup into a foundation-backed social enterprise. Marcus would provide initial funding and business development support, David would handle day-to-day mentoring and operational guidance, and Carlos would maintain complete control over product development and distribution priorities. "You know," Carlos said as they prepared to leave, "when David first told me his story, I thought he was just another convicted businessman trying to rehabilitate his image. But this, what you're both doing, this is real." As Marcus and David drove back toward Denver, something had fundamentally changed in their relationship. They were no longer just brothers trying to overcome a difficult history. They were partners working towards something that mattered more than family reconciliation or personal success. "Marcus," David said as they crossed into Colorado, "I want you to know that I understand what you just did. You didn't have to offer Carlos a partnership. You could have written him a check and walked away." "David, I've spent 10 years building a company that proves I can succeed without anyone's approval. But watching you work with these veterans over the past 2 days, I realize I've been missing something important." "What's that?" "Success isn't about what you can accomplish alone. It's about what you can help other people accomplish together." The sun was rising over the Colorado mountains as the Thompson brothers drove toward home, finally understanding that the best business partnerships, like the best family relationships, are built on shared values rather than shared profits. 10 years after the Christmas dinner that shocked the world, Marcus Thompson stood before an audience of 2,000 people at the United Nations Global Entrepreneurship Summit. But the story he was about to tell wasn't about building a billion-dollar empire or proving family members wrong. It was about the moment he learned that the greatest success stories aren't about individual achievement. They're about what happens when people use their success to lift others higher than they ever climbed themselves. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus began, his voice carrying across the packed auditorium in New York, "I want to tell you about the most successful person I know. He's a convicted felon who makes $47,000 a year, drives a 7-year-old Toyota, and lives in a studio apartment in Phoenix, Arizona. His name is David Miller, and he's my brother." A murmur rippled through the audience. These were world leaders, Fortune 500 CEOs, and international development experts who had come to hear about global business solutions. They weren't expecting a story about a middle-aged ex-convict living paycheck to paycheck. "In the past 5 years," Marcus continued, "my brother has helped launch 847 veteran-owned businesses across 12 states. These companies employ over 15,000 people and generate more than $2.3 billion in annual revenue. The medical device that saved my daughter's life last year was invented by a veteran David mentored. The clean water technology providing safe drinking water to 200,000 people in East Africa was developed by a Marine. David helped transition from military service to social entrepreneurship." Marcus clicked to his first slide, showing a map covered with small flags representing veteran-owned businesses. "David doesn't own any of these companies. He doesn't sit on their boards. He doesn't receive equity or royalties. His role is to help other people succeed, and his compensation is watching them build something meaningful." The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. 10 years ago, my family called David a failure because he couldn't maintain steady employment and drove a beat-up car. They measured his worth by conventional metrics: salary, title, possessions. They were wrong, but not for the reasons you might think. They weren't wrong because David was secretly successful by their standards. They were wrong because their standards were fundamentally broken. Marcus shared the story of their Christmas dinner confrontation, but with a perspective none of the viral videos or business school case studies had captured. He talked about his own pride in hiding his success, David's desperation to prove his worth through deception, and their family's shallow understanding of what made someone valuable. The truth is, we were all failures that Christmas night. I had built a billion-dollar company but couldn't build an honest relationship with my own family. David had convinced himself that good intentions justified dishonest methods. Our parents had raised children who measured love by achievement rather than character. We were all successful by society's standards and bankrupt by any standard that actually mattered. Marcus clicked to a photo of David working with a group of veterans in a modest Phoenix warehouse. "Real transformation didn't happen when my family discovered I was wealthy. It happened when David discovered he could be useful. The most successful thing he ever did wasn't building a business or impressing investors. It was learning to serve other people's dreams, instead of demanding recognition for his own." The audience was completely captivated, as Marcus explained how Thompson Strategic had evolved from a traditional acquisition firm to a foundation that partnered with veteran entrepreneurs. But the real power of his presentation wasn't in the business metrics, it was in the personal stories. Carlos Mendez's medical device has revolutionized rural healthcare in 17 countries. Maria Santos's agricultural technology is feeding 50,000 families in Central America. James Patterson's educational software is teaching literacy to children in refugee camps. None of these innovations exist because of my money or my business acumen. They exist because David Miller spent 5 years learning to see potential that others missed and dedicating his life to helping people achieve it. Marcus paused, looking out at the sea of faces in the UN auditorium. The question I'm asked most frequently is, what's the secret to building a successful business? People expect me to talk about market analysis, strategic planning, or risk management. But the real secret is simpler and more difficult than any business strategy. Learn to measure success by what you help other people accomplish, rather than what you accomplish for yourself. He clicked to his final slide, a photo from the previous Christmas dinner showing the Miller family, but now including dozens of veterans and their families who had become part of their extended community. My brother David will never appear on a Forbes list or ring the opening bell at the New York Stock Exchange. He'll never own a mansion or drive a luxury car. But he's built something more valuable than any corporation. A legacy of human potential realized through service to others. Marcus's voice grew stronger as he reached his conclusion. The Christmas dinner that exposed our family's failures taught us the most important lesson any of us ever learned. Success isn't about proving your worth to people who doubt you. Success is about using whatever gifts you have, money, skills, time, experience, to help other people discover their own worth. David Miller spent 2 years in federal prison for financial fraud. Today, he's one of the most successful people I know, not because he rebuilt his reputation or regained his wealth, but because he rebuilt his character and found his purpose. He learned that true success isn't about what you achieve, despite being underestimated. It's about making sure other people never have to prove their worth the hard way. The standing ovation that followed lasted for 7 minutes. But Marcus wasn't thinking about the applause as he left the stage. He was thinking about David, who was probably in his Phoenix warehouse at that very moment, helping another veteran understand that their military experience had prepared them not just for civilian employment, but for civilian leadership. Later that evening, Marcus called David from his hotel room in New York. "I saw the live stream," David said before Marcus could speak. "That was the most generous thing anyone has ever done for me." "David, everything I said was true. You've accomplished more in the past 5 years than most people accomplish in a lifetime." "Marcus, I need to tell you something. Remember when our family called me a failure at that Christmas dinner 10 years ago? Of course. They were right. I was a failure. Not because I didn't have money or status, but because I had completely lost sight of what mattered. Prison didn't teach me to be successful. It taught me to be useful. There's a difference." Marcus smiled, understanding exactly what his brother meant. "David, what you've built with these veterans, it's the most successful business model I've ever seen. You invest in people, and they generate returns that can't be measured in dollars. That's the point, Marcus. The moment you can measure it in dollars, you've missed the point entirely." As Marcus hung up the phone, he realized that his brother had just summarized the most important business lesson he'd ever learned. True success creates value that can't be quantified, builds wealth that can't be counted, and generates returns that last longer than any quarterly earnings report. 10 years earlier, the Miller family had learned that appearances could be deceiving, and that success came in unexpected forms. But the deeper lesson, the one that had taken a decade to fully understand, was that the highest form of success was teaching other people to succeed. David Miller had transformed from family disappointment to federal convict to one of the most impactful entrepreneurs in America. But his greatest achievement wasn't overcoming his failures. It was learning to use those failures to prevent other people from making the same mistakes. Sometimes the most successful people are the ones who measure their worth not by what they've accumulated, but by what they've given away. And sometimes the greatest victory isn't proving you were right all along. It's helping other people discover they were capable of more than they ever imagined. The Christmas dinner that had once threatened to destroy the Miller family had become the foundation for a legacy that would outlast any business empire. The simple but revolutionary idea that success is only meaningful when it's shared, and that the highest achievement is not rising above others, but lifting others higher than you ever rose yourself. The end. True success isn't about what you achieve despite being underestimated. It's about making sure other people never have to prove their worth the hard way.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.